am really personally thrilled I am especially thrilled to introduce all of you to Stephanie Sykes today. Stephanie is someone I got to know as a former student during her days and my days at Duke Law School. And she was always one of the most gentle public servants. She's extremely humble and incredibly passionate about the work she does. She's someone that I just always remember as being one of the sort of the most kind and thoughtful students. And again, someone whose record of excellence is really, you would never know, by the way, by her humility. She's such a humble person. And so I told her I've been following her work from afar and have been waiting for the right time to connect her with our community. And I feel like this is the perfect time. And I'm just so thrilled that she joined us. She has got some really exciting new things on the horizon professionally that she's going to tell you about. But that makes it really all the more meaningful that you're here today in this really busy time in your life. As many of you could read from her bio that was sent around earlier, she is a graduate of Princeton undergrad, where she majored in politics. And then again, she earned her JD at Duke Law. She has private sector experience at some of the world's most prestigious law firms. And after she found herself in California, she ended up working for the Sacramento mayor's office. From there, she has done this fascinating work as the executive director and founding director of the African American Mayors Association, where she has overseen the daily operations and policy agenda and also the legal affairs of the AAMA. In addition to talking about her interesting career, she is going to share with us today a really fascinating case study on some future of work research that the AAMA did. She very correctly thought that this would be a really good example for our policy students, not only to learn about the underlying policy issues, but also to have a really good firsthand case study of how a small advocacy organization can partner with others and use its efforts to advocate on a really much larger playing field than would be able to be done with just a small staff. So I'm really excited to hear your presentation, and I know we'll have time for questions at the end. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Stephanie for joining us today. We're really thrilled to have you here, Stephanie.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, community. Thank you for having me today. I'm so excited. I love talking to students. I love sharing my path because it truly has been nonlinear. A lot of leaps of faith, but always getting me back to my core values of really being committed to social justice, particularly racial justice and economic justice. Had my bio read, but I wanted to just share the themes for you to really understand how I got to where I am today. So I've always felt passionate about equity and justice from a very young age. I had parents who talked about issues, and growing up in the 60s and 70s, my mom went to a historically Black college, Cheney University outside of Philadelphia, which she will remind you is the first HBCU in the country, and grew up hearing her stories of, meeting civil rights leaders, meeting Coretta Scott King, writing a master's dissertation on Malcolm X, and just understanding the importance of my history in how I perceive myself in the world. So in high school, I was in the NAACP, where I really learned about grassroots advocacy and justice, and how even young people, and we see that again today, that our young leaders really can be powerful and impactful when they come together. In college, I sort of, like everyone else, sort of found myself. I went in as a pre-med student, came out as a policy person, but found my voice in some social justice work at the college at Princeton, did advocacy work with other students where we actually thought about policy and welfare reform, and actually went to the New Jersey legislature and talked about our perspectives. And the lawmakers were just so interested in hearing what we had to say as young, academic students, passionate about the cause. And so I leveraged that into working with the New Jersey legislature for 2 years after college. There, I was a policy associate, policy analyst, I think my title was, and I was a committee staffer. I was for the Democratic majority. I staffed economic development, housing, senior issues, consumer affairs, and really started to think about next steps. Lots of policy professionals are either, very specific subject matter experts, and a lot of lawyers. So I decided to go to law school. So that's how I found myself at Duke. I was involved with BALSA, the the Black Student Law Association, and volunteered, mentored football players, and tried to just focus on being a lawyer and advocate. Did a clinic that Duke had for people with health challenges, particularly HIV, and advocating for them for local courts. And found myself very interested in public interest law. However, the reality, and we hear that conversation right now on the national stage, is student loans. I had a six-figure debt. So I went to a law firm to pay off that six-figure debt. And I will say that I don't regret that decision. I learned so much. You learn attention to detail. You learn how to prioritize multiple stakeholders. At a nonprofit, I have a board, and the board I report to, the board for my association, or my former association, and I'll get to that in a second, is 17 mayors, Houston, Texas, 2+ million people, Holly Hill, South Carolina, 1,200, and you have to prioritize all of their issues with the same urgency. So I think a law firm is excellent training for that. Understanding pressures, how to prioritize, how to communicate to your stakeholders, how to manage up, how to manage down with paralegals. So that was invaluable experience that I bring and I brought to the work of executive director, founding executive director of the association. So just wanted to update everyone as I talk more about the policy. So Friday was actually my last day at the association. I bid farewell to the organization that I helped found, from incorporation, logos, website, all those things, to serve starting tomorrow in the Biden-Harris administration. I'll be the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs in the Office of Secretary for Commerce. So I'm very excited. So in this new capacity, I'll be bringing my work with mayors. So my portfolio will be mayors, governors, state representatives, and to make sure I'm communicating the policies of the administration, and being the front line to us, particularly for commerce, for those constituencies. So that's a little bit about my path. I also bring, as I mentioned, I have 2 kids. So all the work I do is thinking about the world that they want to live in and would benefit from, and a world that will treat them equally and understand their God-given potential. And so that's what's motivated me throughout my career, at least for the last 5, as I built an organization and built my family. My oldest is 5 and my youngest is 2. So that happens simultaneously. So that can happen, the balance. It's tough, but you can do it. So I want to leave that for students as well. And I want to turn to, if you have any questions about my background, I'm happy to share. And, I want this to be engaging. So if you had any questions about my background or experience, just high level, I'm happy to answer those questions now. You could drop them into the chat, I guess, or raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm also would love to share some of the policy work as well that we engaged in over the last couple of years, and how the organization met this moment of crisis. So if there's no questions yet, happy to go.
I'm sure people have lots of questions. I think I'm afraid that you have such an interesting background that we will not get to the policy stuff. So
okay, I'll get to the policy.
And then we'll start with questions. I'm sure there are lots of questions.
Okay, so more specifically about the African American Mayors Association, I will carry that work with me wherever I go. I will always be tied to the organization as a founder. So association in DC, there's an association for everything. So in forming the organization, we really had to think strategically about what is our competitive advantage. I mean, that's the language you hear in business, but you're competing for funders, right? You want to do the work, you want to have your proofs of concepts, you want to have these innovative research questions, but you need money to power that work. And so how you position yourself is really important. So from the inception of the organization, we said that all the policy that we look at will be through the lens of racial equity and inclusion. Historically, I can give you some, level set where we are with Black mayors in the country. There are between 300 to 400 at any given time. The majority of those are small cities historically in the Southeast. And currently there are about 35 Black mayors that govern cities over 100,000 in population. So we consider those our large cities, but there are about 300 cities across the country of 100,000 or larger. But our population for Black mayors, we consider 100,000 or more, the large cities. So that's your Houston, your San Francisco, your Chicago, New Orleans, Atlanta. Atlanta is actually not a top 5 city. You know, if you think it's bigger than it is, we hear a lot about Atlanta, but it's actually only about a little under 500,000 in population. So Houston's larger, Charlotte's larger, San Francisco's larger, Chicago's larger. And so we make sure that there's some connectivity and messaging, because all of those cities are not cities that are predominantly African American. There's a misconception that despite having an African American president of the United States for a whole 8 years, our association continued to get questions of, if the cities of America change, gentrification, if the demographics change, if cities are no longer majority minority, can you have Black mayors? And my answer to that was absolutely. They are mayors. They have, they're progressive. They have ideas, but their ideas around progressive policy benefits all. And they don't all currently even govern cities that are majority minorities. So this level set there. And so as an association, we wanted to make sure that we were responding to the evergreen issues that impact the African American community. So from day one in 2015, 2015 of us really getting out there and working with the Obama administration, we were incorporated in 2014. But by 2015, we were at the table with the Obama administration talking about policing reform. There was a report, the 21st Century Policing Reform. So that was the backdrop of where we really grounded our policy. And from there, we said there are other issues that impact the daily lives of African Americans. So we broadened our perspective so that we could bring diverse leaders, diverse researchers, diverse thought leaders into the conversation. So we started talking more about tech policy. I mean, from a municipal perspective, internet service providers, they have franchise agreements, they have a vested interest in cities. But now we see, fast forward, how important broadband is. It's almost a necessity like water and food to communities for them to really survive this moment. And so we were talking about broadband access from the beginning. We saw that there was a deficit and a lag in our communities, not just in the access, in the whole ecosystem around broadband access. So digital literacy, having a stable home. We've all seen the really unfortunate images of those young girls in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant. So our organization was aware of that. Mayors are very proximate to the needs of their communities, more so than any other elected leaders. And so from that, we built a policy agenda to really leverage the unique perspectives of Black mayors in the country. So criminal justice reform, technology, and another area that we ended up being really innovative on was the future of work. So that is the case study that I did want to share with you all. And so when we thought about the future of work, the thought is generally, how is automation going to impact workers? So we started the project in 2018. We completed the project December 2019. So 3 months before the pandemic really hit. But what's really interesting and why I want to share that work with you is because everything we said there still applies. It's just accelerated. We weren't anticipating a pandemic. We were anticipating, robots and all the other automation and AI and how that affects workers. But now we see that is already happening. It just accelerated the timeline for that. But we found that cities actually have some solid tools already in their wheelhouses to address these challenges. So wanted to share this with you. We, when we entered this initiative, there was only about 4 staff members and interns. So saw an email opportunity that Google.org, their foundation, was actually funding nonprofits to focus on the future of work. But it was a research project. We were an advocacy organization. We gather, we convene, we do press releases, we do statements. We had not really gotten our legs under us for white policy work, white paper work. We didn't have that infrastructure internally. So that didn't stop me. I still made a proposal. I thought about what could we do with our capabilities, what was unique, what were we going to add to the conversation. And so the concept of the paper was to really focus on cities that are the sweet spot for Black elected leaders. So that's 100,000 to 500,000. That is the population that we felt would have the resources to maybe implement recommendations over time, that were prominent enough to be able to get some data, because you need data to do the research, but also maybe some recognition a little bit, so that as we're thinking about communications at the end of the project, there would be cities that are at least somewhat recognizable, so that we could land some, national conversation around the findings. So the takeaway there was that from the beginning, we thought about strategic communications throughout the process in identifying our partners, in identifying the research questions, to make sure that at the end of it, it wasn't just a white paper that was mailed out and sat on desks, right? I tell my team all the time, if a tree falls and no one's around to hear it, you know the rest. It's so important that you're not doing research or doing advocacy just in of itself. You need to be moving the ball and thinking about how are you communicating to the decision makers, to make sure that your recommendations have a chance of being implemented. So without further ado, I'm going to go right to the report. Okay. So as I mentioned, we did the report. So this is a recap of the entire initiative, and this is on the website of the African American Mayors Association, ourmayors.org. So the white paper lives on the website, but I thought it would be more useful for you to see the whole kind of initiative recap. So this gives you a little lay of the land of the African American Mayors Association and our membership. So it's a dues paying membership organization. So while there's about 100 and some mayors that pay dues to the organization, we still provide resources to any mayor who asks for those resources. And it's about a third of the overall population that we're aware of Black mayors in existence. And no surprises there, our membership and also just the general demographics of Black mayors are around the coast, not a lot of representation in the middle. But the organization is a C3, so that means it is a nonprofit that is prevented from being partisan, engaging in electoral politics. So we actually engage with mayors across the spectrum. We engage with the Trump administration, the Obama administration, now the Biden-Harris administration. And there are some Republican Black mayors that, no surprise, in the Midwest and in the South. Go there. So the project background, as I had mentioned to you, we received a generous grant from google.org. We were the second civil rights oriented group to receive from google.org Foundation, and it was a very generous grant. So we were very appreciative of that. And so what was the motivating factor for us to engage in this work? Well, we felt that there was a need for our mayors to have micro analysis. There's these whole, in 2 years ago, last year before the pandemic, there's all these like macro discussions, Black people are over indexed and things that are bad. So we're all we're flipping the burgers, we're the cashiers. So obviously we're going to lose our jobs. But it wasn't very localized. So if I was in, the Southeast, what does that mean for me? What does it mean for me in the Northeast? What does it mean based on my local economy? What does it mean based on my local educational attainment levels? Like mayors love to hear the high level, policy analysis trends. Trends are great, but they want to know, what about me? What about my state? What about my city? And the other demographic thing that you should be aware of when you think about local governments are that mayors tend to be blue islands in red seas. So they tend to be Democratic. That's no surprise. Urban centers tend to be Democratic. But the legislatures across the country, 2/3 are Republican. And what does that mean? The governor's Republican, the legislature. So when you're thinking about what policies you could implement from state-based funds and funds that come through the state, you should have that framework and understand the lay of the land and what's possible. And what we have found is always to advocate as local and as micro as possible. And we see that again being replicated in the conversations around CARES funding, making sure the money goes directly to the city. So same dynamic we see play out in another context. Okay, so another thing that we did is identify who could be great advocates. not just on the surface of, oh, here's some interesting data. We had Gary, Indiana, and what you're seeing on the screen is a graphic flyer for one of our conversations, but we always wanted to just bring in mayors who we believe would believe in the work, not just talking points from their staff, but would make their staffs available and become advocates, evangelists, really, of the work that will go out and talk to other mayors about why this work was really important. So based on our understanding of our mayors, our membership, we identified 2 member mayors, and then we partnered with another organization, NALEO, it's Latino elected officials, appointed and elected officials, to get another city that was a little bit larger, Long Beach. It was a little over 500,000, a more dynamic set up in their economy, so that we could bring in some additional analysis and see if there's trends across those cities. And we wanted the leaders to be diverse because the work was centered on people that are diverse, Black and Latino workers. So a couple key findings. We wanted to make sure, look, there was hundreds of pages of data, and we had an economics researcher from Florida State. We had an educational researcher who graduated from Duke and is a good friend of mine. And we wanted to make sure there were some very specific key findings that I joke, but I'm serious when I say, take that white paper and make it tweetable. So these are the key findings. There were lots of different little nuggets that we found in the research, but the key findings are that, no surprise, Black and Latino workers are disproportionately in jobs that are going to be impacted by automation, only accelerated now in the pandemic. And then jobs that have higher levels of skill are less likely to be automated. No surprise there, but we wanted to get beyond the things that we knew, right? But this is also data that's localized to the cities that we looked at. There's actual tools in cities. They just aren't narrowly tailored for their populations. So in Gary, Indiana, it's a very low educational attainment rate. So if you're talking about STEM, you're talking about engineering, and folks aren't graduating from high school, you're not having the right conversations. Those conversations and job training programs need to start in middle school. So that was the key takeaway, that, apprenticeships work when they're implemented in the right way, not necessarily as an alternative to secondary education, but as a complement, and to give people options earlier on, given the student debt crisis, given how difficult it is that people may have complex family situations, they need those checks and they need to have that. Maybe they go to college later. So we don't want it to be an either or, especially as an African-American organization, but we did see that apprenticeships in those cities work. There was a really bright spot in Augusta. Augusta has one of the largest cybersecurity centers in the country. And while that wasn't a city that we studied, in having these conversations, we started getting these best practices and sharings and bright spots. And in Augusta, students in high school are trained in cybersecurity so that they can graduate with, out of high school, $50,000 or $60,000. And in Augusta, you can buy a home for that. So that's the key there. We want to adjust the policy for the local needs of the local leaders and their communities. So this is the data. I'm not going to go over it because I am certain that it has just accelerated in the pandemic, but we just see that there are, African Americans in these cities, Latinos in these cities are highly susceptible to their jobs being automated. So again, at the end of all of this, we need recommendations. It's not just the apocalypse. I mean, I've sat in so many policy conversations, roundtables, where we talk about the problems, we're preaching to the choir, but local leaders just need tools. They're like, tell me what I need to do. What do I need to do today? And what are some things that don't cost, right? So how can I use the tools I have? And you can always think about costs also as the long term, but realize that if there's some simple solutions based on your data, they're going to be implemented very quickly. So, we talked about the STEM, secondary education. We want to make sure that's level set at the right time. You want to make sure there's an online program. And if you can't do that at the local level, if there's state, based. So we gave them a lot of different tools to say, hey, look at your workforce development board. They have resources, but maybe they're not at the barbershop. Maybe they're not at the supermarket. they need to be where the people who are most likely to have job loss or experience job loss due to their skills that are going to be phased out over time. So a lot of it was just very instructional. And then the other thing that I mentioned was the communications outcome. So we actually have an external communications team, but if you don't have that, what you do is digest a lot of information from a lot of different sources and find what news sources, journals would be most interested in your story, humanize the story, have some spokespeople. We were blessed to have mayors, so they, very easy plug in for a lot of different political news sources, and literally reach out to those reporters and say, we have this report coming. There are paid wire services when you have a report that you want to drop, but we found that just the paid services, wired services, you need to do cultivation of sources. And so that is not something you have to pay someone to do. You can, in the era of Twitter, you can reach out to reporters that are writing on the topics that you're really interested in. So we were really successful in that. It was covered in the US News and World Report. It was translated into Spanish because we covered Latino workers as well. So that was really exciting. And then we gave sample tweets. We did a whole social media kit. That's something an intern can do, where you just plug and play. And then we had our mayors who have tens of thousands of followers retweeting the report, talking about the report, and getting some traction online as well. And then you see the media impressions, that this is all, at the end of the day, we're reporting this to the funder, but we're also reporting this to other funders and other researchers and establishing us as a thought leader in the space. So this timeline is really funder driven, like when we did our deliverables. So I won't get into that. But I do want to share the other thing that we thought about at the beginning of the report. How are we going to socialize this? How are we going to get on the ground? So when we actually wrote the grant, we talked about, here's the white paper, that's part one. Part two is, once the white paper is done, we need funding to go on the ground. So we went to, we had an annual conference, so we had a built-in platform. So we kicked off our preliminary findings at our annual conference, and that's what you see reflected here. On the stage, you see the head of civil rights, the global head of civil rights for Google, that's Chanel Hardy, Mayor Steve Benjamin in Columbia, South Carolina, my dear friend, Dr. Zolene Hill, who's a phenomenal education researcher, and myself. We went to Columbia, South Carolina, which was one of the cities, and we got local voices to talk about future of work. We had the chief of staff for Benedict College, who was a HBCU. It's an HBCU in Columbia. Mignon Kleinberg, she's a former FCC commissioner, also daughter of Whip Clyburn. And they gave remarks to sort of frame the practical issues and applications of future of work and our findings. And then lastly, actually, one of our partners in the work from the beginning was Harvard Law School. They have an institute, the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute, and I met the executive director of that institute through a panel that I was invited to at Harvard Law, and we just hit it off, and we said, when we can collaborate together, let's find a way. So once I got this grant, I said, hey, or saw the grant idea, I said, would you want to be a platform partner? I'm not asking you for anything. So that's a really great way to ask for partnership, just brand partnership. You're not asking to do anything. We're just asking you, when this is done, you'll put your logo on this and you'll provide a forum and add some additional gravitas to the research by having your logo on it. But, we were so lucky that Dr. David Harris was also a great thought partner, but that's not, I said, you don't do anything, but he ended up being an amazing partner and a great partner to this day. He'll be retiring soon, unfortunately, but he throughout the project, he gave us advice and feedback. And the nice thing about the center is that it was a center that just brings thought leaders together. So that's what the center was for, on racial justice. So we had a forum in Cambridge and we brought more mayors. We brought our partners in Leo. We then even got an additional sponsor, because the other end of the scale is seniors, right? That are really getting phased out of the workforce at even higher levels across race and ethnicity. So we actually partnered with ARP to have the conversation. So you see a representative of ARP on that panel. And then we had another discussion in Atlanta. I mentioned the Cybersecurity Center, and we have several mayors that were represented, large-ish and small cities, Augusta, Columbia, Buffalo, and Holly Hill, South Carolina, which is 1,200. They all had perspectives And then we also just offered next steps. So as there's reports percolating, I anticipate the AMA will continue in this space to just think about additional strategies, how they can continue to engage with stakeholders. And now post-pandemic, I think everything we found in this report is absolutely accurate. It's just a need, the needs are just enhanced. So reskilling, all these words you'll hear, reskilling, retooling, LinkedIn has reskilling, Coursera, all of these online resources, but then there's, the other equity piece of broadband that is the undercurrent of all of this. So I suspect that what we have seen with the job displacements, that any civil rights organization, many, whether it's Aspen Brookings, if you're interested in hearing more about these discussions, they're all ongoing right now because it's going to be one of the biggest issues for workers, particularly workers of color that have been disproportionately displaced and who are frontline workers in the pandemic. So here's the picture of the mayors. We can thank them, and that's the case study. So I thought this would be a really great tool, and happy to answer any questions specifically about the report. And if there's anything else I can offer as far as what the African American Mayors Association has been engaged in, I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. We open the floor to questions. If you want to either raise your hand or put it in the chat, we'll take them as people are sort of thinking about them. I would love for you just to start by talking about what it's like to be a founding director of an organization like this. And that must be pretty daunting, scary, exciting, all those things. And how do you even begin to know where to start your efforts?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about that a lot because I hope that AAMA isn't the first of the things that I engaged in that regard as far as founding and scaling. I think that the key is to have a good framework, really understanding your competitive advantage, where do you fit in the landscape of policy groups, to really pick a few key policies and have a really strong board. Because there's a whole administrative aspect, which I brought my legal hat to, and something that I learned on the way about funding and synergies with funders. I would say the most important thing that's been the current throughout is to be resourceful. Make asks. I feel like if I look at my Rolodex of law school friends and undergrad friends, I've said, what can you do? What can you do for free? It's, they may have a PhD, but sometimes I brought them in to just sort badges. So just being very resourceful and also just being innovative. Don't be afraid to step out and say, we're a small organization, but we're going to address this. We're going to ask for this $250,000 grant because I know that our voice is different and that we can add value to it.
Okay, I think I saw a hand raised from Sarah Simba, and then we have a question from Professor Volden as well. Sarah, was that a hand being raised or was that an applause?
It was an applause.
Okay. There you go. All right, well, then we'll turn to our question in the chat from Professor Volden, who directs our Center for Effective Lawmaking Research, which I'm sure you would find interesting as well, Stephanie. His question is, he says he has a question about your new position. So Craig, would you like to ask it?
Sure. So I don't want to step on the current report because there's a lot in there that sounds really fascinating, but I was drawn to the idea of intergovernmental relations, which I care a lot about, and just wondered, well, first, congrats on the new position and thanks for your public service there. But was wondering your perspective on how we're doing on intergovernmental relations. In particular, I'm thinking about whether we're handling the right policies at the right levels of government. Is the national government picking up stuff that they should, leaving things to the states and localities? How do we think about that?
Yeah, so the perspective I'm going to bring, because I get sworn in tomorrow, so I don't want to talk about the perspectives. I will say that I'm very clear that the administration has 4 policy pillars, and it's racial equity and COVID and economics and climate change. And so that is what the administration is going to be focused on. I think that policy, is local. You really see that the leaders, you saw the governor of Maryland, he's Republican, but he had to hoard PPE. That's not where we want to be as a country. But that's where we were left, particularly under the last administration, not to just I know there's probably a variety of political, but that is the truth. It was very clear that it was not, federal, it was locally led. They were very clear. They said that in intergovernmental calls, we participated in that. And you don't want a situation in a national crisis. While we understand home rule and all these things where maybe Texas wants to stand your ground, but Vermont may not. But when it comes to a national crisis that is impacting everyone and unprecedented, you need federal leadership. You need guidance that you can rely on, but you also need funding. So that's the interesting piece. So in the first round of CARES, direct funding went to cities that were 500,000 or above. So they could go to the Treasury website and then get the money and then do what they needed to do. Every other city, which is the majority of the cities in the country, because that's probably about 30 cities in the country, had to go to their legislature, right? And again, I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, if the political climate was such that there were some differences or some challenges, then locally, it was challenging, right? And so even to this day, with the fast forward, we had a great conversation with the Vice President Harris. She hosted the African American Mayor Association last week, and the conversation was vaccine rollout. And again, we see the same challenges. So I think, the federal government needs to have a great framework that we trust, but local leaders need to be empowered, not just with guidelines, but with money. If you have staff that's going to be, the vaccine distribution centers don't happen by themselves. It's not magical. You can't just ship the vaccine to a school or a gymnasium and just hope it gets implemented. People have to be paid. And right now with sales tax, which is a primary revenue source, as well as property taxes for states going down, there's no extra money to get those extra bodies in the room to implement things. So I would say that the resources, we need a new look at resources. I know that's been a challenge in Congress that goes directly to states and local governments at the smaller levels.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from our dean, Ian Solomon.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie, so much for joining us today. It's great to finally meet you after hearing Jill talk about you so much and with such admiration. Really appreciate learning about your work, your leadership. Congrats on your new position in the Biden-Harris administration. I want to go back to the report on the future of work and the communities most vulnerable to automation. I think the work is interesting. The conclusions are important. And as you mentioned, COVID has had a dramatic impact on these communities and precisely on these dimensions of increasing automation. I think we could anticipate that post-COVID, we'll see the pace and scope of automation just accelerating. Has there been discussion among the mayors about how to capitalize on this? We're not quite there yet, but this post-COVID moment. I don't know to what extent they've capitalized on the legislative opportunity with this new stimulus bill. But it seems that there is an argument to be made for a wholesale kind of rethinking post-COVID of some of our healthcare vulnerabilities, some of our employment vulnerabilities and lack of safety nets. And I think the areas most who'd benefit most and or who will pay the highest price are probably these cities where your members are responsible. So what is the dialogue now, and who is helping that dialogue? Are there universities, think tanks? Is it your own small organization that you're now going to abandon to take this new role? Where is the intellectual energy to think about this post-COVID moment for Black-led cities or for cities with high minority populations?
Yeah, so we're in DC. There are a lot of phenomenal just think tanks. So I'll just address the academic point, whether it's the Urban Institute, the Joint Center for Political Economic Studies, led by Spencer Overton. They, focus their research on Black and Brown communities. Brookings, they have some phenomenal researchers of color, and Aspen has looked a lot at future of work and income insecurity. So I think for mayors, and at least for the organization, the way we look at the pandemic, the way we look at policing reform is the same. It's racial injustice. It's historic racial injustice that has led to disproportional impacts of negative outcomes, whether it's when you're meeting with a police officer, what that outcome will look like, or whether you're meeting with a doctor as a pregnant woman, what is that going to look like? And so that is the context that the mayors are thinking about all of the policy, at least from the association. And one of the things that I was so excited to be joining this administration is because that is also the context and my understanding that policy will be looked at, that racial equity will not be separate. It will be a theme and analysis for all of the departments. All the departments, there was a slate of racial equity executive orders that all of the departments are charged with looking at policy through the lens of racial equity. And so I think the mayors, we actually, as a nonpartisan organization, did engage with the last administration just quietly. There's always this optics consideration. There was this awful picture early in the administration of HBCU presidents like a day before HBCU funding was cut. And so the lesson learned there was, hold the feet to the fire, write the letters, have the calls, but you don't need to take the photos. You just had to figure out the right strategy. But we did engage with the last administration on a lot of things. And so, the mayors are excited and have more of a direct line with both, staff going, their staffs, their partners, some mayors. We have 2 mayors that are current and former mayors. So, oh no, actually 3. So Marty Walsh in labor, he's a mayor of Boston. Obviously Pete Buttigieg, mayor, Department of Transportation. And then Congresswoman Fudge, my understanding, she's a former mayor as well. So there's that local perspective that will already be baked into understanding that local governments really implement and are also these laboratories for innovation. So I'm really hopeful, and those conversations have already happened. We already had that conversation with Vice President Harris, literally the second or third week, which was amazing. And I believe this week the mayors are talking to the Secretary of Transportation. So those conversations are already there. And I think having those leaders that have served locally will really impact the way policy and also grants and funding will probably be implemented. I suspect, but I don't start until tomorrow.
All right, we have a question from Tatenda. I saw a hand raised somewhere.
Yes, hopefully you can hear me well. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for your remarks and just getting to hear about the amazing work that you've done, and congratulations, like everyone has mentioned. I just wanted to ask, I know at the beginning you had mentioned a little bit more about leading through crisis. Batten is a school that really focuses on teaching us how to be leaders and leading without easy answers and leading in just different contexts. But I wanted to hear a little bit more from you on what advice, what lessons you've learned in the past on leadership, and particularly during this past time we've been gone through, where there's been a lot of moments of crisis, and how to mobilize the different stakeholders, or there's funding in different areas that you have to kind of keep going in order to keep the mission and to keep the particular policies or things that you have top of mind moving. Yeah, I just wanted to hear a little bit more if you have any other stories or things that you wanted to share.
Sure. I'll talk a little bit more about the business of running a nonprofit, I think, to respond to your question. And, I have a staff and I have a team, and we are absorbing all of this work. Like, we're responding to it. We're doing press statements, every time. For a while there, a couple years ago, every time there was a shooting, unarmed African-American, we make some response. And we decided to sort of pivot to that because the work of doing that was really wearing on us. And I looked around as a leader and I was seeing advocates having health challenges. One of my peers, literally young woman, had like a stroke. Like it is so emotional because you cannot detach yourself and the people that look like you. And so I have to think of as a leader of people, my staff, thinking about them as whole people, asking them, what do they need? How can we, do you need a day off? When there's really some, Philando Castile, I remember I said, we're just going to go to lunch. We're just going to talk. And then you're going to go home, and you have to understand that, we're people first. And so I tried to lead with that and think more about holistic work. We're home. People had family members in our communities that were ill. One of my staff members did get COVID, recovered. And so in those moments, you have to really have empathetic leadership. And also, well, you have to be a servant leader. I have to be willing to step in, and if someone's having a bad day, these are extraordinary circumstances. And while I feel like we were really good with keeping a drumbeat and shifting to this virtual environment and sort of deconstructing 2-hour conferences into like a couple hour sessions, it was a lot. So I wasn't perfect, but I think the lesson learned there for the staff was also investing in their professional development. So I went to the board and I said, we need a professional development budget, and I'm going to let them take whatever class they want. They need to be full leaders in this association. So that's hard as a nonprofit to, invest those resources that could go to other things, but I thought it was really necessary in the moment. Externally, you do see a lot of racial equity commitments. I feel like what I've seen, a lot of the larger donations have been more pre-existing relationships, but we actually still did really well. And I think the key was that, to continue communicating out, we're here, thinking about all the tools you have in your virtual wheelhouse. It wasn't perfect. Like, is Zoom better than a stream? Like, what are the analytics? What are the things that you can quantify and report back? Really relying on data. We launched a podcast in the middle of this to also think about other ways to engage unique conversations. And then Clubhouse came and kind of destroyed the whole podcast industry, but we're still retooling. And so we just had to experiment. But I will say that we were lucky. We actually were growing. As I'm leaving, we're growing. We launched a summer program. So if students that are interested, there's a Future Leader program. It's on the website, ourmayors.org. And we said, what is needed? People want to see local leaders, and there's not a lot of pipelines for that, because if you go to these top schools, maybe you go to the Hill, but do you go back to your city and run for mayor? Do you go back to your city and become chief of staff? Because that role is really important. So we saw that need right now in the gaps we saw in the professionalism of staffs of different cities. And so we launched that. And so caught the eye of Amazon, who's in cities. They fully funded that. So we grew from 3 summers last summer. It's going to be 11. It's going to be virtual, and it's fully paid. And when the world opens, their housing and everything will be paid to really attract students of color to be in the pipeline. So I think it's also just it's a little bit of instinct, but it's also reading the tea leaves and really looking where there's deficits where you can innovate.
All right, do we have other questions? We'll definitely be looking at that program, Stephanie, for our students.
Yeah, I think there's about 1 more week. So future leaders, you do not have to be African American, but you do need to be interested in policy through racial justice and equity. So
I actually have a question. If I don't want to jump, if someone else has one, raise your hand. But I had a question. I was interested in the talk about apprenticeships. My mom is actually a graduate of the Gary, Indiana public school system. And so I've always, Steve and my colleague Steve Hiss, who's here today too, he's a graduate of Purdue University. And we've talked about, he's been talking to me, we've talked about some of the high school programs that Purdue has actually invested in to try to help increase their pipeline, really focusing on actually starting at the high school level, try to teach students some more of the skills that they just weren't getting in some of these high schools in places like Gary. And so I was curious about the role of higher education, if you see that there's more that could be done in that area.
Yeah, so when we think about colleges, I think colleges are going to have to think about themselves as institutions of lifelong learning. That's the only way I think that they can be also successful and thrive. And I think more so when we look at HBCUs of different sizes, some have been extremely successful in cultivating resources over the last couple of years, and others have not. So there's a really important role to play, because I think the other important part, and I know any large university is a huge part of the local economy. So we can't really divorce that messaging. You're employing people. And so it's not just coursework, it's also a community of workers. And that messaging needs to be more clear to decision makers. And I know larger universities can probably afford economic impact studies. They probably have them. Smaller schools do not. And when we think about apprenticeships, I think there's a messaging challenge, right? Because we struggled with that. I'll be honest, we struggled with that as being one of our recommendations. And mainly because we're like, is it okay for a Black organization to tell Black people to do apprenticeships instead of college? It's a really tough messaging point. But we stepped away from an either or. So we just were really delicate around the messaging. We made sure that we're talking about, the whole point of college is to have a livable wage. There's a conversation about the minimum wage right now and universal basic income. A lot of mayors are doing experiments and all these things. So it's about wages, it's about opportunities. And if apprenticeship can give you a $50,000, $60,000 job in a community where that can buy you a house, I mean, that's the conversation. And I think obviously universities and community colleges and hire, the Dukes of the world, the UVAs of the world, if you're not doing these partnerships with community colleges, you should have a pipeline for people to go to the more affordable option, given the education cost crisis, to then matriculate in your school. So whether that's apprenticeship training, so it's more workforce, but just having those partnerships for opportunities so people can think about education at different points in their life.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question? There must be. Oh, we've got our associate dean.
Craig's hand is raised.
Okay. Oh, we have Craig, and then I think I saw our Professor Shimshak maybe as well. Go ahead, Craig.
Sure. The pleasure of a second question. So I was intrigued by you starting with it as an advocacy organization and then adding the research component. The center I'm directing really going in the opposite direction, starting with our research and then thinking about an advocacy component. Mm-hmm. I think together they're pretty powerful, but I think there's also some trade-offs involved there. And so I was wondering how you experience an organization that's more advocacy or more research, or how to strike that balance just right.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Well, a couple things. Obviously, there's like the parameters, the legal landscape. If you're a C3, like, can you lobby? So what is advocacy? So you have to kind of think about those questions. So we're a C3, we can't really lobby. So our advocacy, what does that look like? I think having original data that you can point to is really important. I think data and research can inform your work, especially if you're thinking about research questions that are very unique to you. I think about our research or, other things that we've engaged in. It's like, are we being additive to something that's happening, or are we being, innovative? This is brand new. Are we just kind of asking for something that is in existence to just modify it a little bit? And so depending on what the topic is for you, you just have to see where your friendly competitors are. That's really, you have to kind of do a market analysis. So for us, we're, African-American mayors, we're at this intersection of civil rights. So that's NAACP, Urban League, and then municipal organizations. So there are other municipal organizations in DC. There's the US Conference of Mayors, there's the National League of Cities. They all have their different flavors. So I think you should just literally do that kind of SWOT type of analysis, what your strengths and your weaknesses are, do kind of like a market, like high level market study to see where are you situated and see where they are. So it was really important for us to have original research on future of work because there were other organizations doing that. But we looked at what they were doing. A lot of it was survey. And so we said, we need something that's actually like heavy PhD, like footnotes, regressions, all of that, and kind of take it up a notch. And also then marry kind of not just this, the jobs are going, because I think that information was already kind of out there in different formats. What is the new layer? So that's why we thought the education piece of actually doing a curriculum analysis and all of those things, we were adding something new to the conversation. And so I think when you're adding something new, it's great to have new research to add something new. But I would just say you need to situate yourself, especially if you want to get to the leaders and the decision makers and the press. You need to kind of figure out where you're oriented and to how you can lean in with your unique voice based on where you're situated on the spectrum.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Dean Shimshak, looks like you have a question.
Sure. Hi, Stephanie. Thank you so much. I had two questions, but I think I'll focus on the first in the interest of time, which is you mentioned vaccine rollouts and of course the future of work. What are you thinking are some of the other key priority areas for Black-led cities and cities with very large Black and minority populations?
Policing reform is still going to be huge. That has not gone away. We have not, there was the George Floyd Policing Act that was not passed in the last Congress. So we're still advocating for that. The association released the Mayor's Peace Pact that actually came out of conversations and best practices of mayors. It's been really well received. And then we've more recently partnered with the Black law enforcement officials to really amplify the best practices that we've shared in that piece. Climate change, but more holistically thinking about environmental justice, right? So if you're in a community with pollution and you have asthma, that's why you're going to have poor COVID outcomes. And so I think that the Biden administration, I mean, I'm biased, obviously I'm joining, but I think they've articulated some really key pillars that really mirror what they probably were hearing on the ground, particularly from multicultural communities. And so definitely leaning in on climate change, but the impact of environmental justice, so water, lead, flint, making sure you have the infrastructure in your community to withstand the climate crisis. Like our communities are getting flooded, our communities are being polluted. So I think that's another important one, and we still have a ways to go on policing reform.
Okay, we might have time for one more if you want to slide your other one in.
So my other one actually builds off of Tatenda's question, which is as founding director of an organization who is now moving on to other things, at least for some period of time. How do you think about leadership transitions?
They're tough. They're definitely tough, but they can't start when you're ready to leave. So I would just joke with my team that, if I get hit by a bus, and they're like, you're not getting hit by a bus. I'm like, okay, I won't use those terms. But so for the last probably 2 years, I focused a lot on that. So whether it was professional development and training programs, my team is pretty young, but also including them, making sure that we weren't I have my silo, you have your silo. And in the virtual environment, that was even more challenging. So we implemented just technology to help with that. So whether it's Slack, Asana, these project-based things. And I was trained up in a law firm where you just bring your notepad and you manage everything off your notepad. And so I'm at the cusp of that millennial, like not quite. So I had to convert my thinking because we used to sit in a WeWork. So I could just say, hey, do this, hey, do that. What about this? And so really just, even though we were a small team, making sure there's those processes in place to make sure there's sustainability. But I know that there'll be some good announcements. And then in the short term, there'll be interim. And then in the long term, I think they'll be doing a national search, but there'll be some good announcements coming out of where the organization landed. But I also have confidence in my team that I trained them up at least to execute for the next 12 months or so. We did a project plan.
All right, I think that brings us to the end of our hour. And Stephanie, I think it's very clear to everyone why I'm such a big fan of yours, and just again, knowing that you're literally between 2 jobs right now and it's a holiday and you shared your time with us makes this just all the more meaningful. And I'm so personally proud of all the amazing things you've done, and I'm just thrilled to know that you're going to be joining the administration, and excited to see all the things that are to come. And we are going to send some students to your former organization to look at their internship program right away.
Please do. So just thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Happy to share, and you're happy to reach out to me. My social media is now a little locked down because of my transition, but you can reach me at stephanie.mash, which is my maiden name, @gmail.com.
All right. Thanks, Stephanie. Take care and good luck tomorrow.
Thank you. Have a good holiday, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.